You know, if there's one question I get asked more than any other, more even than if you had the chance to invent a country, what would you name it? That question would have to be, Mark, in a universe full of generic plastic point-and-shoot cameras from the 1990s, can the Canon SureShot Z70W cut the mustard to become the keenest camera in the analog cosmos? Well, today we're going to try and answer that question. Please let me introduce the Canon SureShot Z70W, or is that the Canon Prima Super 28? And if it's the 28, is it the 28V or the 28N? This schizophrenic model naming is annoying, and I'm really not sure it's completely necessary. I mean, yes, if I was to have a camera called a Lucky Dragon 888, it might go down better in the Chinese market. Definitely better than a capitalist 444, but seriously, it's not like any of these titles sound like they were invented by anything other than a primitive beta of ChatGPT, which is interesting when you think about it. A name is an important thing to get right. Just ask my old high school friend Wayne King. There have been a few unfortunately named cameras before, of course. The Argus Lady Carefree springs to mind. If that sounds like a feminine hygiene product, then understand that there was an elite model which I assume came with wingtips for extra security. So look, names are important, and don't worry, I will give due thought to what name I will give my own invented country as the video progresses. But the fact that Canon made a habit of naming their cameras in different ways for different markets is a bit frustrating. I have reviewed a couple of point-and-shoots on this channel before. My camera cupboard is full of anonymous pieces of plastic from a range of manufacturers. For the most part, they're kind of similar, but nevertheless, they do all sit within some kind of spectrum. For example, this is the Canon Prima 5, or SureShot Max, or Autoboy Mini, depending on where you're from. This little fella came out in 1991. Features a fixed f3.5 38mm lens with shutter speeds of an eighth to a 250th of a second and 3-point autofocusing. This, on the other hand, is a much more sophisticated model, the Pentax SBO 120SW, also known as the IQ Zoom 120SW. It's a more recent model, arriving in 2001, right at the time when film cameras were breathing their last gurgling gasp. With a 28 to 120mm zoom range, aperture of f5.6 to f12.8 at the long end, and a shutter speed maxing out at 1/350th of a second, this is certainly a lot sleeker, better made, and ostensibly it's better technology. So where does this camera sit? Well, somewhere in the middle. This thing has a zoom lens, but it's not the zoomiest zoom of all, with a 28 to 70mm proudly labelled 2.5 times on the case. It has that trick up its sleeve over the Canon Prima 5. That zoom comes with a cost, and we'll look at that a bit later. Suffice it to say, with a maximum aperture of f5.6 at the 28mm end, that's still quite small, and reduces down to 7.8 once you zoom to 70mm. The Pentax maximum aperture at the long end is a tiny don't bend over in the shower imprisoned to pick up the soap f12.8, but it does at least go to 120mm at the long end. So it's trying to manage the trade-offs inherent in these cameras. But is it the Goldilocks of cameras, sitting comfortably between the two, right in the middle, the more primitive Prima 5 and the more sophisticated Pentax being just right? Or is the compromise just too much to bear? As in 3 bears, okay. Moving on. It's not the smallest for sure though. Coming in at 230 grams without the battery, that's 2 bars of soap dropped in the prison shower. None of these things are going to break your back though. It has enough heft to be substantial, but you could still hook the wrist strap around your neck without it feeling like an albatross. Similarly, the size is really good. There is a point at which a camera becomes too small to use to be comfortable, and it's nice to have something that actually feels like a camera. It can still be operated one hand, thanks to the sliding cover that also turns it on. It feels good in the hand for sure, but we don't just use these things so that we can look hip at the local skate park. This was a gift from a colleague who gave it to me along with a couple of other items she was throwing out. So thanks, Glenda. I've already run one roll of black and white film through it, and it seemed to work without any light leaks. But what about the pictures? Are they any good? Well, to give it a real test, I mortgaged the house to fund a roll of Kodak Ultramax 400. I figured to really get that point-and-shoot experience, it seemed only fair to run a fairly fast color roll through it so I could then give the camera its best chance, and at least the film was more in date than my jokes or my pop culture references. So far, so good. It was time to take it to the city of Perth in Western Australia for a morning walk. Alright, that one was probably at about 35 millimeters. Obviously I don't have any sense of the exposure. And look, I don't know, you probably noticed a bit of reticence as I was walking through the back alley. I was having a slow start. That's not unusual and can often be attributed to my slow brain, especially on a Sunday morning. I suspect the cost of colour film might have something to do with it too. I really should replace my authentic Z70W shutter sounds with the mercenary ka-ching in my videos as I clock up depth for each frame to reinforce the angst. Honestly though, I always do struggle with photographing street art. I mean, it's someone else's work essentially. What am I bringing to the process other than recording it on film to share with you guys? Of course, none of this has anything to do with the camera itself, just the numpty behind the lens. But if I seem a bit dithery over the next few shots, that's only because I'm struggling to find some context for the art. Either an odd angle highlighting the flaws, brickwork, or other imperfections as it fades over time, or including other elements for context. At least that's my excuse. I'm sure you've had the same experience too. No? No? Okay, well, let's continue. So the trick is to take photos of other people's art and not make it look like it's just their art. So for example, those broken holders, whatever they are. All right. Oh, I like the light on that. Taken 6 photos, 30 more to go. Oh, I love a little detail. Yeah, it's going to be difficult finding a composition in here. Definitely something, and I have a horrible feeling that this is going to get demolished. So, oh, into the sun, well into the sun. All right, so I'm going to try and shield the sun. Stop the flare. Compose first. I don't know, that might be shit. Which is a little bit annoying. Alright, let's get that. It's alright. What's going on there? Not quite sure what he wanted. What am I going to make of that? What about another minimalist shot of just red and white? See how it works. Oh look, that might work, might not. Don't you love the blend of old and new? Get the tree out of there. Hay Street Mall, the centre of the city, with shops open and nobody here. believe it or not, this is not a medieval artifact. It was actually built in the 1930s. So, should we go down and walk along? This is not exactly flattering light. Can I get more in if I get wider? Focus on you. It does intelligent autofocus, it thinks. 3, 2, 1. Alright. Here we go. Quite liking that slight rainbow reflection there. I wish I had a longer zoom and I don't. There we go. Ascalon. Worth a photo on its own. Wow, 2 pairs of headphones. It's dedication. Zooming in a bit. I might even put the flash on for this. Very rare for me. Force flash. Turn the flash off. So we'll take a picture of that. That's it. Not bad for a humble point and shoot. Actually, this is an auspicious camera. At least it comes with an endorsement. Patrick McMullen on his website describes himself as an American photographer, columnist, a television personality, publisher, art collector, philanthropist, businessman, documentarian, and survivor. Aren't we all? Look, okay, I'm not American, and I'm not sure that my kid's portrait of me done in year 3 and stuck on the fridge with blue tack really does count as an art collection. What he is known for primarily is for being that guy at the Hollywood premieres and awards ceremonies that takes snaps of celebrities. In that sense, he's probably got the largest archive of celebrity photographs, more than anyone else in living history. What has that got to do with this little camera? Well, actually not very much, other than, well, he was featured in the August 1997 edition of American Photo, spruiking the virtues of the Canon Z70W. In particular, he notes the clamshell design and the 28mm focal length. Well, there's nothing really unique about that clamshell design, but it does speed up the process of turning the camera on. The 28mm lens is a much more interesting proposition. While wide-angle zooms were common among SLRs at the time, most point-and-shoots tapped out at about 35 to 38mm. The fact is, it's difficult to make a decent wide-angle lens, and generally my experience has been at the extreme end of the focal range, point-and-shoots tend to, well, kinda suck. You get spherical aberration, which often means the corners are soft, particularly at large apertures. Well, don't worry about large apertures on this device. It starts at f5.6, so you're never going to get that Noctilux creamy bokeh all of the time, or any of the time, really. It is interesting, though, that he mentions the Olympus stylus and the Contax T2. Well, this lacks the tiny footprint of the stylus or the luxury feel of the T2, but it is significantly cheaper and is probably notable for having one thing in common with those much hyped cameras, and that is resolving power. This thing is really pretty sharp. I mean, you tell me. Let me know in the comments what you thought of these photos, but honestly, I was pleasantly surprised. With 400 speed color film, I was able to document my city walk with aplomb. A few takeaways. The distortion is negligible. Honestly, that's not so much an issue these days with digital post-processing, but if you were to darkroom print from these negatives, well, you wouldn't be disappointed. There were absolutely no corrections made on this image, so you could actually feel comfortable shooting horizons and architecture on this thing. Flare was really well managed. You will have seen that I deliberately pointed it at the sun on a couple of occasions. And even if the photos themselves weren't amazing, at least it wasn't just a low contrast wash of haze or rings of distracting ghosting or flare. It feels really good in your hand too. If I'm going to be honest, I don't really enjoy using point and shoots that much. I always feel a bit separated from the photographic process, but I enjoyed my walk, and while I probably can't attribute all of that to the camera itself, I also enjoyed the photos it took. Look, I'm not going to read the spec sheet to you. You can pause the video, read it for yourself. On paper, honestly, it doesn't seem that attractive a camera. While a 28mm wide end is amazing, 70mm isn't really telephoto, and you'll have seen there were a couple of times I did crave something with a bit more length to pick out the details of the buildings and render the architecture without any kind of distortion. Yes, I did cheat a couple of times, keystoning the image in Lightroom to manage the perspective from being more close up than I would have liked and having to look up as well. Not a huge fan of flash on these things, though it's reputed to create a nice balance of fill for ambient light, which is not true of a lot of cheap film cameras that render your subject as a white fuzzy spectre in front of an inky background. One of the few times I did use flash though, it managed to really not look too distracting. Let's be callously objective and weigh up the pros and cons of this camera. We'll start with the cons first because they're glaringly obvious. f5.6 is eye of the needle small, but I wasn't taking pictures of rich people trying to enter the kingdom of God. I'll leave that to Patrick McMullen and his virtue signaling celebrities. My suggestion, never use anything less than 400 speed film in this thing. It even says so in the manual. As a test roll, I shot some Ilford HP5 bulk loaded into a 1600 speed film canister. Yes, this thing actually uses DX coding to rate the film like a lot of point and shoots. You still do get spherical aberration around the corners of the image, so you're not going to have perfect edge-to-edge sharpness. And yes, that bloody flash will come on automatically as soon as you draw back on that sexy clamshell. The film advance is noisy, it's not the most responsive camera in the world, and it does have a limited zoom range. But you get to go wide angle, and while 70mm is the limit, it meant I didn't miss too many shots. One of my minor gripes about this much sexier Pentax is that at 120mm at f12.8, well, it's great in good light, but it's very hard to hold that steady in overcast conditions when you're zoomed out with a slow speed film. So in those situations, it's kind of useless. See here for some successes and failures of that particular camera as I go on safari in the untamed wilds of Singapore. And yes, that comment was said ironically. A couple of times the little Canon missed infinity focus, and I'm going to attribute that to low light fooling the autofocus because it was late in the day here, and let's be honest, I might not have been paying too much attention to the green LED confirmation light. I might also have had a couple of drinks beforehand. But when it latched on, 1600 ISO film gave crisp and clean results that belie this camera's humble specs. I never thought I'd get a decent wildlife photo out of a camera like this. I mean, yes, it's an environmental portrait, 70mm remember, But again, more examples of the flare resistance of this camera. Let's be clear, this is not an SLR killer. This version isn't even the top of the line. There was a Canon Prima Super 28V and N which added extra fruit such as a rubber finger rest, viewfinder marking for parallax when you're close up, as well as focusing indicators depending on the mode you're shooting in. But functionally, it's just the same camera and it takes the same quality images. And speaking of focus, the fact that it does have the ability to switch between spot focus and exposure or intelligent scene settings depending on the mode you're using is kind of neat. Ultimately though, it's a point and shoot, and the fun of it isn't trying to wrangle the modes to get specific results. That's just an exercise in frustration, and you really do need a more professional camera for that. Just put fast film in it, turn it on, and point it at something interesting and see what it produces. That's about all you can expect from a film point and shoot, and honestly, that's the joy of them too. So I'm quite happy with this camera. With just 2 rolls of film, I've got plenty of keepers, and I wouldn't call any of them portfolio worthy, but I am looking at printing a few photos soon. I mean, how else am I going to decorate the halls of my palace of my invented country? Because hey, if I'm going to invent a country, I've got to rule over it in imperial splendor. As for the name, my country needs a name that's worthy of its leader, obviously. Maybe something photo-oriented, like Kodacopia. I can't call it Ilford. That name's already taken, and sorry Brits, but who the hell actually wants to live in Ilford anyway? No, this will be a volcanic island in the Pacific. I've got to have that supervillain lair with helicopter pad and missile launchers. There'll be 2 volcanoes on this volcanic island, Mount Fuji and Mount Olympus. Mount OM System isn't really a very catchy title, and obviously that one's not going to be active anyway. I will rule over it all my Canon Z70W, the scepter of the state. If it sounds like I have delusions of grandeur, well, Kodacopia isn't an empire and I don't aspire to be an emperor. It's not a kingdom and I'm no king. It's just a country. And I'm well qualified to rule that because after all, I am a country. Later.